Jake Morrison had been working on the frontier colony of New Terra for almost 3 years now, and he thought he had seen everything the galaxy could throw at him, but apparently he was wrong, because standing in front of him was an invitation that made absolutely no sense at all. The holographic card floated above his desk, displaying symbols he could barely read thanks to his translation implant, and what it said made his heart skip several beats. He was invited to a royal wedding on the planet SCIFI-HFY. Jake rubbed his eyes and read it again, but the words did not change, and he had no idea why he of all people would receive such an invitation, since he was just a simple agricultural consultant who helped alien worlds improve their farming techniques. His colleague Danny sat across from him eating synthesized protein bars and looking bored as usual, until Jake showed him the invitation, and then Danny nearly choked on his food. Danny grabbed the hologram and spun it around, examining every detail with wide eyes before letting out a low whistle that echoed through their small office. Jake had met some Zalarian diplomats a few months ago when they visited New Terra to learn about human farming methods, and he spent 2 weeks teaching them about crop rotation and soil management. But he never expected this kind of follow-up. The Zalarians were a proud warrior race who stood nearly 7 feet tall with blue skin that shimmered like water under moonlight, and their culture valued strength, honor, and family above all else. Jake was only 5'10" with brown hair and a tendency to get sunburned easily, so he felt completely out of his depth. But the invitation made it clear that refusing would be considered a grave insult. Danny thought the whole thing was hilarious and kept making jokes about Jake becoming an intergalactic diplomat. But Jake was genuinely nervous because he knew nothing about Zalarian wedding customs. He spent the next week researching everything he could find about Zalarian culture and weddings, but most of the information was vague or contradictory, and the universal translator could only do so much with cultural nuances. What he did learn was that Zalarian weddings were enormous affairs that could last for days, and involved complex ceremonies that tested the worthiness of both families involved. He also learned that humans were considered something of a curiosity in Zalarian society, because despite being physically weaker than most spacefaring races, they had spread across the galaxy with surprising speed and tenacity. The day finally came when Jake had to leave for GalacticPrime, and he packed his nicest clothes, which consisted of one decent suit that he usually wore to formal colony meetings, and hoped it would be appropriate. The journey took 3 days via commercial transport, and Jake spent most of that time trying not to panic about the thousands of ways he could accidentally insult an entire alien civilization when the ship finally entered orbit around GalacticPrime. Jake pressed his face against the viewport and stared in wonder at the planet below. GalacticPrime was stunning, with vast oceans that glowed purple under the light of twin suns and continents covered in cities that looked like they were carved from massive crystals. The shuttle descent was smooth, and Jake found himself landing at a spaceport that made every human facility he had ever seen look like a crude shack in comparison. Waiting for him at the landing pad was a Zalarian woman who introduced herself as Kira and explained that she would be his guide during his stay. Kira was beautiful in an alien way, with skin that shifted between shades of blue and purple depending on the light, and eyes that seemed to see right through him. She wore elaborate robes that marked her as someone of high status, and she moved with the deadly grace of a trained warrior. Jake tried to make small talk as they traveled through the city, but Kira remained formal and distant, answering his questions with the bare minimum of information. The palace where the wedding would take place was beyond anything Jake had imagined, with towers that reached into the clouds and walls that seemed to be made of living light. Kira led him through countless hallways filled with other guests from dozens of different species, and Jake realized this was going to be even bigger than he thought. His room was larger than his entire apartment back on New Terra, with a bed that could fit 5 people, and windows that offered a breathtaking view of the royal gardens. Kira informed him that the pre-wedding celebrations would begin that evening, and he should wear his finest clothes before she left him alone to prepare. Jake took a long shower in a bathroom that had more features than his entire childhood home, and tried to calm his nerves. He put on his suit, which suddenly felt incredibly inadequate compared to the elaborate outfits he had seen other guests wearing, and hoped nobody would notice. The great hall where the celebration was being held was absolutely packed with guests, and the noise was overwhelming. Jake tried to stay near the edges of the room where he could observe without drawing too much attention to himself. The food was incredible, with dishes from hundreds of worlds arranged on tables that seemed to stretch forever. And Jake tried small portions of everything, while trying not to think about what some of it might be. He was attempting to identify a particularly interesting purple fruit when someone tapped him on the shoulder. Jake turned to find himself face to face with a Zalarian who was even taller than most, with broader shoulders and an air of authority that made Jake want to stand up straighter. The Zalarian introduced himself as Commander Zex and explained that he had heard about the human who taught their agricultural teams and wanted to thank Jake personally. Jake felt relief wash over him as Zex seemed genuinely friendly, and they spent the next hour discussing farming techniques and the challenges of feeding growing populations. Other Zalarians joined their conversation, and Jake found himself surrounded by warriors and nobles who all seemed curious about humans and their methods. One of them asked Jake about human combat techniques, and Jake had to awkwardly explain that he had never been in the military, and his only fighting experience came from a bar fight in college that he lost badly. The Zalarians found this hilarious and seemed to respect his honesty more than if he had tried to exaggerate his abilities. As the night wore on, Jake began to relax and actually enjoy himself, until Kira appeared at his elbow and whispered that he needed to come with her immediately. The serious look on her face made Jake's stomach drop, and he excused himself from the conversation to follow her into a quieter corridor. Kira led him to a private chamber where several important-looking Zalarians were waiting, and Jake's nervousness came rushing back. An elderly Zalarian with elaborate facial markings stepped forward and introduced himself as Elder Mora, before asking Jake if he understood why he had been invited. Jake explained that he assumed it was because of his work with their agricultural teams, but Elder Mora shook his head slowly. The elder explained that according to Zalarian custom, when someone teaches valuable knowledge to another family, they create a bond that must be honored. Jake nodded along, not understanding where this was going until Elder Mora dropped the bombshell be teaching the Zalarian delegation. Jake had unknowingly entered into the first stage of a marriage arrangement with the king's daughter. Jake felt the room spin around him and had to sit down before he fell down. Elder Mora continued explaining that the invitation was not to attend a wedding, but to participate in one as the groom. The princess, whose name was Lyra, had specifically requested him after hearing reports of his kindness and expertise from the delegation. Jake tried to process this information, but his brain seemed to have stopped working properly. He stammered out that there must be some mistake because he never agreed to marry anyone, and he barely knew anything about Zalarian culture. Elder Mora nodded sympathetically and explained that this was why Kira had been assigned as his guide, to help him understand what was happening and what his options were. Kira stepped forward and explained in a gentler tone that Jake could refuse the marriage, but doing so would create a political incident that could damage human-Zalarian relations. The king had already announced the engagement, and backing out now would be seen as a rejection of the entire Zalarian people. Jake felt panic rising in his chest as he realized he was trapped in a situation that seemed impossible. He asked if he could at least meet Lyra before making any decisions, and Elder Mora agreed that this was reasonable. The next morning, Jake was woken early by Kira, who informed him that Princess Lyra had agreed to meet with him in the royal gardens. Jake dressed quickly and followed Kira through the palace, trying to figure out what he was going to say. The gardens were even more beautiful up close, with plants from countless worlds arranged in patterns that seemed to tell stories. Waiting by a fountain that flowed with water that changed colors was the most striking Zalarian woman Jake had ever seen. Princess Lyra was tall like all her people, but she moved with a fluid grace that reminded Jake of dancers he had seen back on Earth. Her skin was a deeper shade of blue than most Zalarians, and her eyes were bright silver that seemed to glow with their own light. Wore simple robes that somehow looked more regal than the elaborate outfits Jake had seen on other nobles. Lyra dismissed Kira with a gesture and turned to face Jake with an expression he could not read. For a long moment they simply stared at each other before Lyra spoke in perfect English that surprised Jake. She explained that she had been studying human languages and customs for months in preparation for this meeting. Jake found his voice and asked her directly why she wanted to marry someone she had never met. Lyra smiled slightly and explained that Zalarian royal marriages were always arranged for political purposes, but she had managed to negotiate for some choice in the matter. When her father announced he wanted to strengthen ties with humanity, she saw an opportunity. She had reviewed profiles of hundreds of humans working in Zalarian space, and Jake stood out because of the reports from the delegation. They described him as patient, kind, and genuinely interested in helping others succeed, rather than just collecting a paycheck. Lyra explained that she wanted a partner who valued knowledge and cooperation over conquest and domination, like so many Zalarian nobles. Jake listened to all of this and realized that Lyra was just as trapped by politics and duty as he was. He asked her what would happen if they went through with this marriage, and she explained that he would become a prince of Prime. With all the responsibilities that entailed, he would be expected to represent both humanity and the royal family in diplomatic matters and help bridge the gap between their two cultures. It sounded overwhelming, but Jake could see the logic in it, and he found himself actually considering the idea. He asked Lyra what she wanted personally beyond the political considerations. Lyra was quiet for a moment before admitting that she hoped they could at least become friends, and perhaps eventually, something more, but she would not force him into anything. She explained that Zalarian marriages could be dissolved after a trial period of 1 year, if both parties agreed, so he would not be trapped forever. Jake appreciated her honesty and found himself warming to her despite the insane circumstances. They spent the rest of the morning walking through the gardens and talking about everything from farming techniques to music preferences. Jake learned that Lyra was fascinated by Earth culture, particularly human literature, and had read everything from Shakespeare to modern science fiction. Lyra learned that Jake had never planned to leave Earth, but took the job on New Terra. After a bad breakup left him wanting to start over somewhere, completely different. By the time Kira returned to collect Jake, he had made his decision. He would go through with the wedding, but only if Lyra agreed to help him learn everything he needed to know about Zalarian culture and politics. Lyra agreed immediately, and seemed genuinely relieved that he had not rejected her. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation, as Jake received crash courses in Zalarian etiquette, ceremonial protocols, and the complex political landscape of the royal court. Kira proved to be an excellent teacher with seemingly endless patience for his questions and mistakes. Jake also had several video calls with Danny back on New Terra, who found the whole situation hilarious and kept making jokes about Jake becoming space royalty. Wedding ceremony itself was scheduled to take place over 3 days, with each day representing a different aspect of Zalarian culture. The first day focused on martial prowess, and Jake was expected to participate in ritual combat trials. Jake was terrified of this part because he knew he could not possibly compete with trained Zalarian warriors, but Kira assured him that the trials were more symbolic than anything. The morning of the first day, Jake was fitted with ceremonial armor that felt incredibly heavy and given a training weapon that was still intimidating despite being blunted. The combat trials took place in an arena that could hold thousands of spectators, and Jake felt his stomach churn as he entered. His first opponent was a young warrior who looked like he could tear Jake in half without breaking a sweat. The fight began, and Jake immediately realized he was hopelessly outmatched as the warrior moved with blinding speed. But something strange happened as Jake focused entirely on defense and surviving rather than winning. The crowd began to cheer not for the warrior but for Jake, as he refused to give up despite being clearly outclassed. Jake took hits that would have knocked out most humans, but he kept getting back up with a stubbornness that surprised even himself. Finally, the match was called, and Jake had technically lost, but the crowd roared their approval anyway. Lyra later explained that Zalarians valued courage and determination more than victory, and Jake had proven he had both. The remaining combat trials went similarly, with Jake losing every match but earning respect through his refusal to quit. By the end of the day, Jake was covered in bruises, but felt strangely proud of himself. The second day focused on wisdom and knowledge, with Jake expected to participate in philosophical debates with Zalarian scholars. This was more in Jake's wheelhouse, and he found himself actually enjoying the discussions. The scholars were impressed by human perspectives on ethics, cooperation, and the balance between individual freedom and social responsibility. Jake drew on everything from ancient Earth philosophy to lessons learned on the frontier colonies, and found that humans and Zalarians had more common ground than he expected. The final debate of the day was with Elder Mora himself, and they discussed the nature of cultural exchange and how different civilizations could learn from each other without losing their own identities by the end. Jake and the Elder had reached a genuine understanding and mutual respect. The third day focused on community and family, with Jake expected to participate in a massive feast where he would be formally introduced to the extended royal family. This was somehow more intimidating than the combat trials because Jake had to remember dozens of names, titles, and proper forms of address. But Lyra stayed by his side throughout the evening, helping him navigate the complex social dynamics and laughing off his occasional mistakes. Jake found himself genuinely enjoying the celebration, and even made friends with some of Lyra's younger cousins who were fascinated by stories of Earth as the evening wore on. Jake realized that this could actually work, not just as a political arrangement but as a real partnership. The actual wedding ceremony took place at dawn on the fourth day in a temple carved from a single massive crystal. Jake wore traditional Zalarian groom attire, which felt strange but looked impressive according to Kira. Lyra entered, wearing robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself, and Jake forgot to breathe for a moment. The ceremony itself was beautiful, with ancient rituals that spoke of two individuals becoming stronger together than they could ever be apart. When it came time for Jake to speak his vows, he abandoned the formal speech he had memorized and spoke from the heart. He promised to respect Lyra as a partner, to learn from her culture while sharing his own, and to face whatever challenges came their way together. The crowd was silent as he spoke, and Jake worried he had made a terrible mistake, until Lyra smiled at him with genuine warmth. Lyra's vows were equally heartfelt, and Jake realized that despite the unusual circumstances, this was becoming something real. When the ceremony concluded, Jake was officially Prince Jake Morrison of SCIFI-Prime, and he had no idea what came next. The celebration that followed the ceremony lasted for 2 days straight, with guests from across the galaxy coming to pay their respects. Jake met ambassadors from the Galactic Council, representatives from dozens of human colonies, and even a few species he had never heard of before. Everyone seemed curious about the human, who had married into Zalarian royalty, and Jake did his best to represent both Earth and his new homeworld. On the third night, after the celebration finally wound down, Jake and Lyra had their first real moment alone together. They sat on a balcony, overlooking the capital city, and watched the twin suns set in a sky filled with colors Earth never had. Lyra asked Jake if he regretted his decision, and Jake thought about it seriously before answering. He told her that he never imagined his life would go in this direction, but he did not regret it because he believed they could build something good together. Lyra took his hand and admitted that she had been terrified he would hate her for putting him in this position. Jake squeezed her hand and told her that they were both victims of circumstance, but that did not mean they could not make the best of it. The next few months were challenging as Jake adjusted to life in the royal palace and learned the intricacies of Zalarian politics. Attended countless meetings with various nobles and officials who all wanted to assess the human prince. Some were openly skeptical of him, while others seemed genuinely interested in learning about human culture and perspectives. Jake made it a point to be honest about his limitations while also standing firm on his values and beliefs. He refused to simply become a puppet or token human and insisted on being involved in real decision-making. This earned him respect from some quarters and hostility from others, but Lyra supported him throughout. Together, they began working on initiatives to improve cooperation between and human colonies and Zalarian worlds. Jake's background in agriculture proved surprisingly useful as they developed programs to share knowledge and resources between species. Lyra's political skills and connections opened doors that Jake never could have accessed on his own. They also began developing a genuine friendship that slowly started to become something deeper. Jake found himself looking forward to their evening conversations when they could drop their public personas and just talk. Lyra seemed to enjoy his perspective on things and often asked his opinion on matters both political and personal. 6 months into their marriage, Jake realized he had fallen in love with his wife, and he had no idea if she felt the same way. He decided to be direct and simply asked her during one of their evening talks. Lyra was quiet for a long moment before admitting that she had been falling for him too, but was afraid to say anything in case he did not feel the same. Jake laughed at the absurdity of both of them being too nervous to admit their feelings, and pulled Lyra into a kiss that felt like coming home. From that point on, their relationship deepened into a true partnership in every sense of the word. They worked together during the day and spent their evenings exploring both Zalarian and human culture together. Jake introduced Lyra to Earth music, movies, and literature, while she taught him Zalarian art forms and traditions. They traveled together, visiting both human colonies and Zalarian worlds to promote cooperation and understanding between their peoples. Jake found that he had a natural talent for diplomacy when he could be himself, rather than trying to fit some formal mold. His willingness to admit ignorance and ask questions earned him respect from beings who were tired of posturing, and empty rhetoric. Lyra's position gave them access to powerful figures, but Jake's authenticity made those figures actually listen. Together they became known as the bridge between humanity and the Zalarian Empire. A year after their wedding, Jake and Lyra were invited to Earth to meet with the leaders of the United Earth government. Jake had not been back to his home planet since leaving for New Terra, and he was nervous about how he would be received. But when they arrived, they were treated like celebrities, with crowds gathering everywhere they went. Jake's parents were flown in from their small town, and they were completely overwhelmed by everything. His mother kept crying and hugging him while his father just stared at Lyra with an expression of complete bewilderment. Lyra won them over by asking Jake's mother to teach her how to make traditional Earth foods and spending hours in the kitchen learning family recipes. Jake's father warmed up to her when she asked intelligent questions about his work as a mechanic and showed genuine interest in human engineering. By the end of the visit, Jake's parents were completely charmed, and his mother made Lyra promise to visit more often. The trip to Earth reminded Jake of how far he had come from being a simple agricultural consultant to being a bridge between civilizations, but it also reminded him that he was still just Jake at his core, with the same values and dreams he always had back on Zelar Prime. Jake and Lyra continued their work, but they also began thinking about the future. They talked about having children and what it would mean to raise kids who were part human and part Zalarian. The medical challenges alone were significant, but the cultural implications were even more complex. But they decided that if they were going to build a real bridge between their peoples, having a family that embodied both cultures made sense. 2 years after their wedding, Lyra gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, who had features of both their parents. The children had Lyra's silver eyes and blue-tinted skin, but Jake's facial features and bone structure. The birth was celebrated across both human space and the Zalarian Empire as a symbol of cooperation and unity. Jake held his children and marveled at the impossibility of his life. He had gone from being a divorced agricultural consultant on a backwater colony to being a prince father and symbol of interstellar cooperation. None of it made sense, and yet somehow it all felt right. Lyra kissed his forehead and told him she was glad he came to that wedding. Jake laughed and said he was glad too. Even though he had shown up thinking he was just a guest, their children grew up surrounded by love and two rich cultures that taught them different but complementary values. The boy, whom they named Alex, showed an early interest in science and technology, while the girl, whom they named Kira after Jake's guide, showed a natural talent for diplomacy. Jake and Lyra raised them to be proud of both their heritages and to see their mixed background as a strength rather than a source of confusion. As the years passed, Jake's role evolved from uncertain outsider to respected member of the royal family and genuine leader in his own right. He never stopped learning about Zalarian culture and never forgot his human roots. He and Lyra worked together to create lasting institutions that promoted cooperation between species and broke down barriers of misunderstanding. Looking back, Jake realized that stumbling into that wedding was the best accident of his life. He had found purpose, love, and a family in the last place he ever expected, and he had learned that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones you never planned to take. The human who went to an alien wedding, not knowing he was the groom, became the prince who helped unite two civilizations. It was not the life Jake Morrison had imagined for himself, but it was the life he was meant to live, and he would not trade it for anything in the galaxy.